And we're back. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another weekly episode of vBrown Bag. This evening, I am very excited to present to you Shannon Keene. She's a developer advocate from Microsoft, and we are going to be talking about accelerating your journey to cloud with Azure VMware Solution. As a lot of the longtime show attendees know, VMware is near and dear to our heart, and we've also got a whole bunch of MCSEs in the crowd too. So there's going to be a lot of good stuff in the pipe to see how all of this comes together, both in the Azure and the VMware space. But first, we've got a couple of housekeeping notes. If you want to get in on the conversation, I will be, Shannon won't be, I'll be taking care of this. The moderation of said questions as they come flying in from our peanut gallery. If you at vBrownBag on Twitter, or if you if you're live in the audience and they enter into the Q&A, I will be fielding all of the questions. You can either at vBrownBag or hashtag vBrownBag. I'll be paying attention to it on my little tweet deck over here. And of course, we also have the other channels as well. We've got the Latin America channel, the EMEA channel, and the Brazil channel. For those episodes and for those shows, pay attention to them, and they will be telling you what's coming up on their schedules. So our guest tonight is Shannon Keene. You can follow her on Twitter at ShanKuehn, not KEUHN. Very important to get that straight. And I, of course, am Chris Williams. You can follow me, but I highly encourage you not to, at Mistwire. So with that, let me do a little stop share. Shannon, you ready?
I am. Let's do a share here. I always feel a little Zoom deficient because we spend all of our time in Teams.
Ta-da!
Is it working? Awesome.
It is working. I love your pictures. I love your pictures.
Good. Yeah. So it's the ops advocate, right? And I think if you think about developer advocates, it's hard to think about the fact that there are also operations folks. And so we always like to include, I forget his name. I always call raccoons trash pandas, but the operations trash panda, right? It's terrible. And then I cartoonified myself a couple of years ago.
So derogatory.
I know, I'm terrible. But no, yeah, but I always think he's cute. One of my colleagues started drawing him out and it's gained traction. You'll probably see him all over any of the advocacy work that we do at Microsoft. So I think he shows up on the Twitter handle. I'm sure he shows up. I think they've even published icons to GitHub if you ever want to make your own stickers or things of that sort, because it's been hard to pass out stickers in the middle of the pandemic.
It has been. I apologize. I called you a developer advocate, but that's not true. You are an ops advocate.
I'm technically an ops advocate, but we still sit in developer relations. That's where it gets super muddy and confusing. There are a couple of teams in the DevRel world or developer relations that focus on IT ops. And if you followed anybody in the cloud family that report up through Rick Klaus, that's one of the teams. I report up through Jeremiah Dooley. And both of our teams focus on a lot of trying to get out info on demystification of Azure.
Nice. Jeremiah is a longtime contributor to the show. We love ourselves some Dooley.
Yeah, I think he had a vBrown bag. I want to say it was like 3 or 4 months ago because he was asking me for some interesting slide decks on some Azure related pieces. So I think he did the high level overview, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he did. Nice.
Very cool. Very cool. So yeah, as Chris has mentioned, I'm Shannon Keene. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft. I report up to Jeremiah Dooley. He's my boss. He's awesome. He doesn't pay me to say that, but he is really awesome. And, we hang out in the world of social media. So if you are ever curious on ways to reach me, I'm very active on Twitter, really active on LinkedIn as well. I started there first, which is weird. It's very different. Most advocates start on Twitter. I started on LinkedIn and I've slowly moved into the world of Twitter. So either of them are great spots to grab me. If you have additional questions, if you want some ideas on how to make sense of everything I presented, or if you just want to connect and see some interesting stuff that I wind up doing, because I don't just focus on Azure VMware Solution. I try and think about that full enterprise stack and ways you can make sense of Azure. So today's conversation will be around the acceleration of your cloud journey to Azure by using Azure VMware Solution. So let's talk about the introduction and the background to the service. I feel like that's where we should probably start, right? When you're thinking about making sense of a new service. So there's a number of cloud migration considerations that every enterprise is struggling with right now. You might see customers, or you might be at a firm where you're at software end of support, or software and hardware refreshes are coming, and those are very costly. You might also be in a situation where you need capacity, and capacity is hard to come by these days with some of the chip shortages and things of that sort. Then you might be sitting underneath a weird data center contract expiration too. You want to probably get out of the data center business at some point because it leads to a lot of heartburn and headache over time. I'm very gray as a result of that, right? I finally just let the gray come through a couple of years ago.
And I'm bald as a result of it too. So that's, you
Either
know,
or, you either become gray or you go bald, right? That's kind of
there's no winning. There's no winning with this.
so then you have to think about cost and complexity, right? There's compliance standards you might have to adhere to, right? Application refactoring. If it was straightforward to go from a monolithic application on-prem with a number of different tiers to cloud native, we would have waved our magical cloud wand and we'd already be there. We're not. It's going to take some time. So you have to figure out, do you wait until everything is at the right spot to move, or do you move ahead of time and sort of think about picking apart that monolithic app so you can have more cloud native resources, right? You have to think through business continuity, downtime, project resourcing. You have to think about who's in charge of what, because many times you're also fighting fires on-prem. Just think through the business and people processes and I guess the people in and of themselves. So you have to think about change management, what that looks like when you start moving your assets into the cloud, the need for operational consistency. So you have built up years and years and years of practice on-prem, especially in the VMware realm. That's where a lot of folks built out a lot of great standard operating procedures, automation, hooks into things like ServiceNow. So you have to figure out, how do we bring about the same operational consistency without having to embrace a very large learning curve. Then there's the DR and backup stories as you move into the cloud. What do we do when we move there? As well as the need to grow the cloud competency overall. It's not a straightforward process. In fact, a lot of times when I have conversations with folks about what digital transformation looks like for them, I get a lot of apprehension and anxiety. So these are the cloud migration strategies, right? Rehost, refactor, re-architect, and rebuild. So it's not straightforward to get from left to right. If it was, like I said, we'd already all be in the cloud. We would have been in the cloud in 2010, right? When Azure first came about. One thing to note here, though, is prior to Azure VMware Solution, the only offering in the rehost, or the kind of lift and shift pattern of cloud adoption, was IaaS. So you had to embrace infrastructure as a service, which did come with a little bit of a learning curve. Now Azure VMware Solution lives over on that side of things, and it starts to help you speed up that transformation process because it's the same environment that you have on premises. These are just kind of a quick high-level overview of some of the challenges with migration of your existing app estate. There's that risk of business disruption. I forget where these are coming from. I think it's a Gartner report. There's the cloud skilling gap and the refactoring complexity, right? A lot of times customers suffer from analysis by paralysis because they want to have it right out the gate. They don't want to try and wait for a solution to be 100% where it is on premises. They want to kind of have this be like for like, and what you get is it takes a little bit of time to get to that point. So these are things which sort of could disrupt that flow. And if you just all of a sudden move a very complex app into Azure, it could easily bite you, right? It's just the idea that we don't quite know what we have on-prem, and so it's just hard. It's not an easy scenario. So that's where Azure VMware Solution comes into the mix here. So Azure VMware Solution is a comprehensive VMware environment as a service that lives on dedicated bare metal nodes. So we talk about this as bare metal as a service, and it lives somewhere in between IaaS and PaaS. And I'll talk about that as this session continues. So it will run your VMware workloads on Azure the way that it would run on-prem, and it's supported and operated by Microsoft. So it's a first-party service. This allows you to manage and secure your applications across VMware environments on-prem and Microsoft Azure with a common operating framework. Hopefully, folks are starting to realize this eases that conversation. You don't have to embrace IaaS out the gate. You could think about a platform like Azure VMware Solution. So this isn't the first time that Microsoft has decided to build the purpose-built solutions, right? So on top of the native IaaS and PaaS offerings and the seamless integration with Azure services, we have a number of purpose-built Azure platform-based products. So SkyTab, NetApp, Nutanix, Cray, and Azure VMware Solution. So we're starting to realize that customers need complex offerings for their complex workloads on-prem. These nodes are hyper-converged as well, so it's the latest and the greatest related to technology. You'll be able to gain a lot more value add from not having to procure your own equipment, sort of roll your own, so to speak. Right now, Azure VMware Solution is available in all of these regions. And if you followed the trajectory of Azure VMware Solution, you'll know that there was a first iteration of the product back in 2019 that launched with Cloud Simple. We launched the first party service that's Azure native, quote unquote, right? We launched that in September of 2020, so right around Ignite. And ever since, the regional list continues to grow. Hopefully that's showing you we are investing in new regions, and there are additional regions that are going to come online. So stay tuned for more regional availability, because our hope is to bring this to as many regions as possible. So when you think about migrating and extending your VMware workloads to the cloud, this starts to accelerate the pace. You don't have to suffer by analysis by paralysis. You get the built-in continuity, speed, and scale with modern infrastructure living on hyper-converged nodes. You can use your same existing VMware skills and tools. You don't have to go embrace ARM templates or understand all of these new terms and, I guess, resources that you could potentially spin up in Azure. You can seamlessly then modernize over time. You could think about bringing on Azure Active Directory. You could think about bringing on and onboarding things like Azure Security Center. You could think about using an Azure load balancer, where you couldn't do that if your environment was living in a hybrid state today. From there, you also get the unmatched pricing for Windows and SQL Server, so you can think about using your Azure Hybrid Use Benefit licensing. So if you have data center licensing on premises, you can bring that into Azure at no extra cost. On top of the fact that you could get the no cost extended security updates if you're still running 2008 R2, whether it be Windows Server or SQL Server. So let's kind of walk through what this looks like. So the use cases are pretty straightforward, right? Data center expansion, reduction, or retirement. You want speed and simplification of migration. You want to think about hybrid cloud versus only having your environment live on-prem. This might be an opportunity to think about disaster recovery and business continuity. Maybe there's an opportunity to take this in to your environment and have that be your DR site. Then there is the opportunity to modernize over time. So what that then moves into is a planning and deployment phase. We have a number of Microsoft specialists. We've got an actual handful of teams that help customers realize the value of what this would look like for their company. We also have VMware coming in and helping as well. So VMware has dedicated a sales and tech team to all Azure VMware Solution initiatives, or AVS. I almost was going to say AVS, and I don't think I've said. If I ever abbreviate it, it's because Azure VMware Solution is a lot of syllables, and it's later in the day. We also have partners too, right? So where our partner ecosystem has grown, as well as there's a number of interesting programs that could help accelerate and give you some opportunity from a cost reduction perspective to kind of move forward. So I never know what those are. So if you are interested and you're watching, just make sure you get in touch with your Microsoft account folks. They'll be able to better equip you with the right ways to think about potentially spinning this to your business decision makers. So it's as straightforward as creating and deploying an AVS software-defined data center environment from the Azure portal. It's literally a handful of things that you fill out, and boom, it starts to go and build behind the scenes. And then you're able to think about a migration path. So, you'll want to connect the AVS environment to your VMware environment on-prem. You'll use HCX to migrate VMs. And then you'll start to visualize what everything looks like, as you continue to manage vSphere. So you could spin up domain controllers that live outside of Azure VMware Solution, and those domain controllers could talk to your AVS VMs. You could think about, like I said, expanding what you're doing. You could, Azure Load Balancer, Azure SQL, you could extend what you're doing and lean on PaaS resources and start to make use of the cloud. But you also gain some interesting pieces here. So there's the management operations side of it. There's elasticity and scale with Azure. There's industry certifications, and those continue to expand. I recently found out there's some HIPAA certifications that AVS now has. So I can only imagine that at some point here, our healthcare customers are going to go crazy and potentially spin this up in an environment, which is a great reality. So a lot of those customers wait until the right regulations show up for them to be able to deploy this on a cloud provider of choice. There's the high availability, DRN backup, low latency express route, but you can also use native vSphere and VMware tooling, right? So there's vSAN for storage, NSXT for networking, and HCX for migration. All of those come with the actual solution. You don't have to bolt on any sort of bring your own license scenario. And then that modernization side of things, right? Onboarding Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor, storage optimization, scaling out with blob storage. You can think about hybrid hub and spoke. There's a lot of interesting, unique opportunities for you to make Azure be exactly what you want it to be without having to drink from the funnel of Azure as your kind of your first step into a cloud platform. So let's talk a little bit about the new and differentiated features, because we did have that first version of Azure VMware Solution. So it's a first-party service that's cloud certified by VMware. And there's now this seamless Azure experience. So the first go around, there were 2 portals. There's only 1 portal now. Now, Cloud Simple still is around. You might see references to a SKU that has a C in front of it. It still shows up in our pricing calculator, as well as you might see some documentation online. It's still around, but net new customers, we want them to migrate towards this offering just because there's better opportunity to think about a global rollout, and newer features are coming to this version. It's just kind of like your different storage accounts, right? GPv2 is what gets you the blob tiering and all of the lifecycle management. All of the goodies are coming to the newer flavors of the GPv2 storage account. So same with Azure VMware Solution. All of the new goodies, so to speak, are coming to this version. As I'd mentioned, the hybrid use benefit, you can bring that into the realm of Azure VMware Solution, as well as getting the free extended security updates for your older OSs. It's a single point of support, so you're calling Microsoft for any problems. Microsoft will troubleshoot the Microsoft sides of it, and then engage with VMware for anything they have to resolve that might be vSphere specific. There's the latest technology updates, so you don't have to factor in what that upgrade looks like, what patching looks like, what applying updates look like. Microsoft is on the hook for that. The HCX Enterprise Edition is available. What deploys by default is HCX Advanced. The difference between the two relates to site pairings. So if you need more site pairings, and that's just establishing a tunnel between on-prem and AVS. If you need more than 3, you would need to embrace the HCX Enterprise Edition, which is fine. It's a simple add-on related to licensing. And then it's still in public preview. So once it reaches GA, you'll get notification about that change and what the price will be. And you can always opt out of it, right? The high performance dedicated. Oh, so go ahead.
Yeah, a point of clarification on that.
Sure.
When you say more than 3, are you talking about a one to or a many to one scenario, or multiple data centers going to multiple clusters, or?
It could be either, but usually what it is, it's multiple data centers going into AVS. So let's say you had an office in Illinois, an office in New York, and an office in like London. You could think about, those 3 sites, maybe potentially getting a site pairing into Azure VMware Solution. And then you're able to have those 3 sites being handled by HCX Advanced. If you needed more than the 3, you could think about leaning on the HCX Enterprise license key, which is it's a quick ticket into support. And then you would get it enabled for your environment. And then when that reaches GA, you'll get some notification long before it reaches GA about the date in which that will change. And you will start to see an additional charge. So it's going to be a little bit more, but it's something where folks might need it, especially during a migration cycle into Azure VMware Solution.
Right. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Sure. Sure. And these are high performance dedicated hosts. They are your servers. So that's not logically separate, like a lot of the cloud solutions that are out there these days. Doesn't matter what vendor you're on. These are dedicated to you. So there's a unified licensing and consumption model as well. So, we're trying to make things easier to understand in terms of what you're going to be paying if you use pay as you go, what you're going to be paying if you use reserved instances, et cetera. And then there's a simplified NSX interface. So what I've found is a number of customers didn't necessarily embrace NSX the same way. So if you don't have a ton of familiarity with NSX, there's a simplified interface inside the Azure Resource Manager portal that will help. So right now, this is the software and the hardware package. This shouldn't really feel too unfamiliar to VMware admins. In fact, it should hopefully make you feel a little bit more calm, right? It's not 7.0 because we're not going to be cutting edge. We're supporting this for a number of customers. There's a lot of testing and validation that has to happen. So the idea here is we'll probably be N-1 from what's current, because there's a lot of coordination between Microsoft and VMware to make this be a sustainable environment for our customers. So, and remember, you get vCenter, vSAN, NSXT, and HCX when you deploy this. You also get an express route circuit, but I will save that for later because that usually tends to be a lot of question marks, which is totally fine because it's a little bit of an awkward solution, but I think it makes sense if you're familiar with other VMs inside of Azure. There's a couple of other solutions like the S-Series VM for SAP is very similar. On the right here is the hardware specifications. These will probably change at some point. We only have one SKU available, so I can imagine at some point there might be bigger nodes to potentially choose from. But that's what you would get right now. And the hardware vendor, the procurement process, that's all taken care of by Microsoft. So you shouldn't have to worry about it, and we will always take care of it for you. The big piece is at the bottom here. So AVS requires a minimum of 3 nodes per vSphere cluster. There's a maximum of 16 nodes per vSphere cluster. And then there's a maximum of 96 nodes to an Azure private cloud instance. That 96 nodes recently changed. I think it was 64 prior to. So you can start to tell we're dealing with bigger customers and we needed to be able to increase those limits. So I won't spend too much time talking about this because we've already kind of talked a little bit about this. I think the big piece here, though, is the integration with Azure. So a lot of times it's hard to make use of all of the Azure native services because it requires you to deploy resources closer to the ARM APIs. Once your Azure VMware Solution environment is closer to all of the ARM APIs, you can start to think about some of the governance tooling, right? Some of the security tooling. You've got that low latency related to connectivity. You can think about bringing in automation related to maybe there's a DevOps tool that you want to start bringing some pieces into the mix here. If it's already living in Azure and literally all of the DevOps tooling anymore has compatibility with Azure, you could easily bring that into the mix without having to retool too much. And I think we've already talked about the familiar VMware technologies. It's another slide sort of hit home that you're not going into this without a lot of familiarity, right? So none of the things on the far left should freak you out, so to speak. And then you get the high performance cloud infrastructure, you get security and encryption, you've got redundancy and placement control. Those are your servers, they're nobody else's, they're dedicated to you. And they have some self-service provisioning, so you could always increase your node count. Let's say you run a monitoring tool and it tells you need 5 nodes, but you only would need 5 nodes a couple times a month. You could always scale up and scale down as you need it. So there's an interesting elasticity conversations you could have as a customer of Azure VMware Solution. So there are reserved instances. If you like Azure VMware Solution, you don't want the pay-as-you-go price point because it is a little bit more expensive. You could think about reserved instances. So it will reduce the cost up to between 30 and 50%, depending upon what reserved instance SKU you select. The hybrid use benefit, right? You don't have to worry if you have software assurance on-prem. That licensing can translate over into Azure VMware Solution. So if you ever get audited by Microsoft, and those always love to come at the wrong time, you would be covered related to what you've spun up. And then the free extended security updates. So the 3 additional years of free security updates for 2008, 2008 R2, Same with SQL. And I think we're getting a little close on both of those timetables. And the same thing will show up for 2012 when it reaches end of life.
Mental note, we're in 2021.
I know, but we still have customers who are hanging out in that realm. And it's just like, okay.
You know what? I shouldn't say this while being recorded, but I still have customers on NT4.
Oof. I supported a customer once and I got a ticket and I didn't see the splash screen when I already keyed in. I thought it was a 2003 R2 server. So I'm trying to run PowerShell commands, trying to figure out what's going on. And then I'm like, why is there no PowerShell? Tried to install it, wouldn't install. And then I'm like, what OS am I on? It was 2000. I'm like, wow, that one. I mean, I eventually figured it out, but it was the best part about it was I was reading the ticket as I was already peeing on my other screen. And but yeah, that was a fun one to go, why won't this work? Why won't this install? What am I missing? It's a Windows Server 2000. That's what I was missing.
Then your eyes pop a little bit and you're
Right.
like, you guys should think about.
And that wasn't that long ago. I think it was 4 years ago. So it's somewhat scary to see some of these things that are still out there in the wild. But what I found out was it was a mission critical application and they suffered from what a lot of IT shops did. They had lost their proprietary sort of app dev person who spun it up and they were trying to transition on to something else, but they were kind of in the middle of living in this older world versus a SaaS-based solution. So it wasn't a fun reality to support, but we were able to do it. It was just mind-boggling a little bit at first to realize that that still's out there.
It's a song as old as time.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about what the deployment looks like. So you'll create a private cloud in Azure. You'll create a VNet. I always recommend an Azure Bastion and a jump host because while the service is out there, you need a way to access your vCenter instance and you need a jump host to do it because it's still a web interface. Without having a jump host, so you really wouldn't have a way into the environment, at least initially when you're trying to set everything up. I always also recommend keeping the Azure Bastion host after you set up hybrid connectivity, just because you never know what's going to happen in terms of an express route circuit. So it's another way for you to get into that environment without having a public IP on that VM. So the Bastion host has the public IP. It's a lockdown sort of proxy, and it allows you to connect in, and it's all an HTML5 client. So I'll showcase that when we get to that portion of the session tonight. So this service lives on ExpressRoute, like I had mentioned. You get 3 nodes. Let's just say you're going to do the minimum deployment. You get 3 nodes and an ExpressRoute circuit. That ExpressRoute circuit needs to be peered into Azure. So you'll need to create a gateway subnet and a VNet gateway. So that's what allows the ExpressRoute to be peered into the Azure VNet. You'll create the auth key in the VNet gateway, and then you'll connect the AVS ExpressRoute to the VNet gateway. So when you build out Azure VMware Solution, you need to provide a /22 CIDR block that's only used by Azure VMware Solution. All of the magic comes from when that ExpressRoute circuit is peered into the Azure VNet. Then everything's routable. You could start hitting that IP address, even though you might be on a 10.0.0.0/16 network. You could hit your 10.5.0.0/22 network because of that peering connection between the ExpressRoute circuit and the VNet. Then you'll have to connect your VMware on-prem. So you'll connect to the jump host behind the Azure Bastion host. You'll connect to the vCenter instance. And literally, as this shows on the right, it looks very similar to what you already have. It's standard traditional VMware, right? Once the networking pieces are figured out, the rest of it shouldn't be much of an anxiety, a thing that would raise anxiety, right? It looks the exact same as what you have on-prem. You'll connect to the NSXT manager. And then, you'll have to enable global reach. So the piece here is you need your own ExpressRoute circuit. So let's take a step back and let's talk about this just at a high level. You've got the ExpressRoute circuit with your AVS deployment. You'll get another opportunity to have to connect in from a hybrid perspective. So you'll need your own dedicated ExpressRoute circuit. And that's just because VMware needs to back that with a VMware-backed SLA. They don't want you to migrate a VM over a site-to-site IPsec VPN tunnel. They want you to migrate your VM over a dedicated dark fiber. You could potentially think about spinning up a site-to-site VPN if you're waiting for ExpressRoute, but when you get to those mission critical apps, you want your own dedicated dark fiber. So global reach is the piece that enables east-west traffic routing between two ExpressRoute circuits, because without it, it would only route traffic north-south, and that doesn't help you because you need to be able to route between. And then when you enable global reach, you're also introducing BGP into the environment, which is not a trivial task. So it's something you'll want to plot out well ahead of time and just make sure that you're prepped to handle this, because usually, at least in the environments I've worked on, that's where things start to fall down. It's when you're trying to get your on-premises environment to route correctly into Azure. So this is a quick high level of what that architecture looks like. So you're coming in from the Azure portal on the right. This is the Azure region you've chosen to deploy everything into. You're hitting the Azure bastion, right? And you're not connecting to it. You're kind of connecting through it to the jump host. And I'll show this. The jump host won't have a public IP. And then that will allow you to connect to your vCenter instance and your NSX manager. So it's kind of interesting and weird, all in the same vein, but hopefully what it showcases is it's VMware in Azure. And it's definitely the dawning of a new age, right? The fact that you've got a VMware product living in a Microsoft ecosystem, and both companies are best friends these days. It's a very different world than it was 10 to 15 years ago. So let's talk a little bit about architecture for networking next. So there's two different models. There's basic interconnectivity. Now, basic interconnectivity is the point at which you're taking the AVS express route and you're peering it into the Azure VNet. So these are great environments if you're standing something up, you're trying to validate if a solution will work, or you don't have your express route circuit and you haven't really figured out if you're going to extend network connectivity while you wait for your express route circuit. So that would give you basic connectivity. It's great for POCs, MVPs, trying to get used to what AVS can do. This is an opportunity to think about maybe Azure integrations that you might want to bring on while you may be waiting for your express route circuit. This is the full interconnectivity model. This is where you've got, so think of these green arrows as global reach. So your AVS network is talking to the Microsoft Enterprise Edge router, and that's talking over here to the Edge router that is where your express route circuit's peered to. I should also probably draw a line to the VNet because there's a peering that happens there as well. So it's literally kind of this interesting, maybe sort of intermingled networking web. But your environment over here has got the express route circuit. That's what gets peered into the Azure VNet. Your express route circuit comes from on-prem and hooks into Azure, which also hooks into the Azure VNet. And then you enable global reach so that you're able to route traffic between on-prem and AVS. I always talk about this, and I just mentioned it, right? The idea you could potentially stand up a site-to-site VPN. You'll need a virtual WAN hub because the site-to-site VPN doesn't know how to route traffic to an express route circuit. So you'd have to build out an authorization key and redeem it in order to be able to do it. But this is great if you're doing a little bit of pre-express route testing. Maybe you're migrating a couple of VMs just to become familiar with the process, because not a lot of customers have HCX, right? It's HCX enabled vMotion. I think everybody's familiar with vMotion, but the idea of HCX is kind of a mixed bag. You may not have played around with it. It really is the Swiss Army knife in the VMware kind of tool belt, so to speak. So this might be an opportunity to dig into what that looks like, because you'll create the site pairing in between Azure and your on-prem environment, and then you'll be able to think about migrating those VMs over. So in terms of migration, this is sort of the high-level approach, right? You want to assess your VMware environment, especially if it's been a sprawling environment for years. You might need to figure out, do we move everything? Are there any environments we could potentially decom? That'll help you identify the workloads to migrate. That will also help you define the approach for migration. So HCX supports live, bulk, and cold, just like you would expect. That starts to help you build out the steps towards full-blown production. Then you move to the testing and validation phase. This is where you could lean on your Microsoft account team. They could get you talking with our specialists, either the global black belts or maybe even fast track, to come in and help you realize the value of what this looks like. You'll create a private cloud. You'll move a few VMs using the preferred migration type. and then you'll transition to production. That's where you're doing the at-scale migration and adoption. You could go through bulk migration, you could move a bunch of VMs at once. The reality is you don't have to be the one on the hook, though. You could use Microsoft Fast Track. And like I'd mentioned earlier, we've got a number of partners in the partner ecosystem. And I recently worked with a partner here in Chicago. We're trying to get them certified so they could be potentially sought out in the event that a customer had an AVS migration pattern they were looking to explore.
I have a dumb question.
Sure.
What is Microsoft Fast Track?
So they are a group that lives in Azure engineering, and they are a free resource to customers. They can, I think of them as the movers that are ready to go, right? You call the moving company through your Microsoft account team. They align the right moving company, right? The idea you want to have somebody that knows how to move with Azure VMware Solution, and then they come in and they can help you build everything out. The global black belts are usually also involved. They're the heavily specialized technical teams. I think of them as like level 400 and beyond. They're the ones that work really closely with our engineering team. So those are the two teams right now that are usually involved in a lot of these. And there are a number of efforts now to start to kind of build this out broadly with the field. So there's a lot of interesting efforts right now so that a number of teams could help in the future. It's becoming a very popular service is what we're determining, just because of the fact it alleviates a lot of that anxiety. If you think about Microsoft meeting developers where they are, there's a number of different SDKs, a number of different languages. We've really gone kind of above and beyond with developers, not necessarily true with system administrators. We've sort of forced them down the IaaS path and just hope for the best, right? Well, now you could think about embracing a platform where you're taking the same tooling and skills and then plugging it into Azure. So we're meeting system administrators where they are too. It's kind of like, everybody get on this boat, let's go to Azure.
I gotcha. So the transition, so the fast track folks and the black belts, are they leveraged after? So like in a migration effort, you've got your assessment of the environment, you've got your app dependency split outs, you've got your tiered, your cascading tiers of migration steps and everything like that. Do the fast tracks and the black belts come in when you've got your move groups already defined and they're there to do the move groups?
Good question. Think about the GBBs as coming in before all of that. They'll be the ones to help you with scoping things out. There's folks that are helpful with that return on investment. VMware can also be plugged into the mix. They've got some interesting economic analysis they can run within your environment once you get, like, say, Azure, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, once you get like a tool like Azure Migrate to come in and run an assessment. So think of them as more so kind of the pre side of the equation. They're the ones that get you prepped to go. In fact, usually the global black belts, the team of them are involved kind of in that POC or the MVP, the minimum viable product. And then fast track would be kind of who they would pass the baton over to sort of speed up that process. Or you could lean on partners as well. So there's options. You're not solely on the hook for a migration pattern yourself. You could start to think about scaling out what you're able to do, especially if you have tight timelines. And usually that's when you would see a customer say, we have to be out of this data center contract by, I don't know, let's just say the end of June, right? That wouldn't be realistic if they were starting today, but usually those are some of the drivers, right? Like middle of the year, end of the year. And so then you could have all of the Microsoft teams help on top of the Microsoft partners.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Sure. So then Azure Migrate is one of our favorite tools to talk about. I think of it as a multi-pronged assessment tool. It can assess your VMs landing on IaaS. It can assess if your servers could potentially be placed into web apps. It can assess your VDI infrastructure and figure out if you're ready for something like Azure Virtual Desktop. There is a database migration assistant, and now there's an Azure VMware Solution assessment. So you can run it just like you would if it was on in your VMware environment on-prem. I always recommend running it as long as you possibly can. If you can only run it for a week, that's fine, but 30 days would give you a lot more data to pull from. And then you could start thinking about what that cost analysis will look like. And so when the product launched, the second iteration launched in September, this was in public preview. This reached GA as of Ignite in March. So because of COVID, we ran Ignite twice. twice. And that was the time frame that this reached GA. So this is something that can be plugged in. If you like RB tools, or there's a number of different types of third-party tooling that you could still use, you can definitely use it. I love to give Azure Migrate some kudos, because it as a product has gone through a number of levels of maturity. I mean, like I said, it's kind of your multi-pronged tool to assess a number of different environments to figure out exactly where your workloads could land. So we're using the HCX tool to migrate into Azure. So that's where you get the live migration without kind of the cost, complexity, or risk of refactoring. You could just take your VMs, live vMotion them with HCX into Azure VMware Solution, and everybody's happy. It seems to be a happy reality, right? And I'm sure there could be a blip here and there, but it's very minimal on the downtime front, right? It happens. We're still in operations, unfortunately. But I think the big piece here, though, is the minimizing the downtime. You may still want to change window, but there may not be a noticeable downtime for that migration of your workloads. So then you get to extend the tools, skills, and policies into Azure VMware Solution, and that starts to eliminate the cost of reskilling out the gate. You can reskill at a time that makes more sense. So it is VMware Cloud Foundation. It's the same software suite that would run, say, AWS's flavor of VMware on AWS or GCP. But you're close to all of the ARM APIs. So you get access to the Azure Resource Manager APIs. You could think about some of the interesting integrations. I talk about them up there in this slide here. So Azure Active Directory, storage, security, PaaS-based solutions. And then there's a number of third-party partner services that are certified as well. So this is definitely, I think, following a lot of our other infrastructure-focused solutions, where you're seeing a lot of third parties sort of come up and play along, because they realize there's a lot of VMware customers out there that still have their infrastructure living on-prem. So the HCX into Azure VMware Solution, you could think about a large-scale bulk migration. There's the replication assisted vMotion, which is helpful. Then the any vSphere to vSphere migration. So if you still have multiple sites, you could enable HCX and live vMotion your servers into a different vSphere instance as well. It doesn't have to just be AVS. HCX allows for that site pairing, and for DR, there's limited DR functionality using HCX. If you are a site recovery manager customer, stay tuned. There should be some interesting announcements in relative short order. Then there's the parallel VM migration threads. So you could, these VMs migrate a lot faster. The interconnect appliances start to help out from a WAN optimization perspective, and they speed up that actual replication pattern. You could lean on HCX to allow for a layer 2 extension into Azure without having to NAT, which is awesome. So as much as I hate to say this, we could still continue the sort of bad habits we've developed over the years, especially if it takes too much time to break apart that legacy application. And then HCX becomes that secure proxy for vMotion and replication traffic. So I think the next piece that I like to talk about is management and operations. So a lot of times you'll see a similar slide where Azure is just in the middle. Well, now we could think about Azure VMware Solution as being in the middle, because you get an opportunity to bring about the governance tooling. You could add additional security by the Azure native security tooling. So Security Center, Sentinel. There's SIEM integration as well. There's Azure Defender integration, as well as threat protection. So there's all kinds of stuff you could think about from a security perspective. Then there's the protection components. So Azure Site Recovery is an integration, as well as backup. What's called out here is the Microsoft version of a backup. So Microsoft Azure Backup Server, but there are third-party backup vendors that are available. You could bring about Azure Monitor. You could think about some of the automation and configuration components leaning on Azure native. So Azure Automation, Update Management, any of the configuration states that you need to handle within your environment. So desired state configuration. And then you can think about all the nifty, neat governance tooling. So policy management, cost management, and Azure Advisor is your best friend. If you're not familiar with Azure, Azure Advisor will always tell you when you could size down a VM, or when you could power off a VM, or what size you could reduce your VM to, so you're reducing cost. So these same tools can be used with Azure VMware Solution, which is great. It's the familiar and consistent VMware tools and technology, though, that really start to tell this tale the best, I think. So you get that operational consistency. You get to continue to use VMware for resources running on an Azure infrastructure that you're not having to manage. Microsoft's doing that on behalf of you. The vSphere client, NSXT manager, that's all being handled by Microsoft. So access to vSphere, HCX, and NSXT are enabled during the deployment. Credentials are registered in Azure to connect to those environments. And I'll show you how that looks like in the portal. It's kind of cool what we've done. There's a seamless management for Azure infrastructure resources, so you can easily scale infrastructure as your business needs it. You can scale through the portal, and if there's a portal component, there's some sort of automated component as well. And so a lot of customers are building out interesting things with Azure CLI, Azure Automation, Azure PowerShell. You could provision the environment with Terraform, ARM templates. I made a call out earlier today. If somebody's super savvy with Bicep, hit me up, because I'd love to see if there's a way we could get AVS spun up with Bicep. That's the brand new programming sort of language, infrastructure as code, that's kind of ARM templates version 2.0, if you're familiar with ARM templates. So, but yeah, it's really cool. So you could bring about extra capacity when you need it, and then you could reduce that capacity, and you're only being billed for the nodes that are online. So let's say you're able to bring about 4 nodes. You're not being billed for 4 nodes, you're being billed for 3. But let's say at the end of the month, you run a pretty hefty calculation cycle that requires additional infrastructure. You could scale out and add that additional node, and bringing about a node is a 15 to 25 minute exercise, which is super fast. I mean, think about adding an ESXi environment or a node on premises. That would take forever. You've got to procure the equipment, you've got to rack it, make sure it's connected in the right switch, load the installation software, run the installation software, onboard it into vCenter. So it takes time. In 25 minutes, let's say I think it's a little closer to 25, you'd have that extra node, and you don't have to worry about any of the continuity, I guess, problems you might see if you were having to do it on your own. And so, as I talked about before, it's a minimum of 3 nodes per cluster, 16 nodes in a vSphere cluster, and then up to 96 nodes in an Azure private cloud instance. This is the slide I think I love the most, because it's the shared responsibility matrix. So we have one for IaaS, we have one for PaaS, we have one for SaaS. I think most cloud providers have this. It's hard to figure out at what point you're on the hook for something and your cloud vendor's on the hook for something. This is the shared responsibility matrix for Azure VMware Solution. So I don't know about you, but what comes out to me when I look at this slide is the hardware failures. You don't have to worry about a power supply failing at 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. That's when they love to fail. I don't know what it is about power supply vendors, but they love to fail at your local time zone, 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. And then your phone is just, blown up with messages, whether it be text messages, emails, etc. Microsoft is now on the hook for that. Microsoft's also on the hook for host patching, for upgrades, for the actual physical infrastructure, all of the security in our data centers transition over to the bare metal nodes. And so we're on the hook for deployment, lifecycle management, et cetera. You get to focus on more cool sides of lifecycle management of your applications. And I think that's been the hard thing for a lot of IT pros. I think we all realize automation is cool, but we almost never have time to focus on it because we're too busy fighting all of these fires because we manage the full solution. Microsoft can handle that now, and you could give yourself more time to figure out ways to bring more innovation into your workloads. So let's talk once more kind of the architecture. So the portal's over here, right? And it's the same portal that you would use for any other Azure resource. Your private cloud is accessible in the portal. It's connected to Azure by way of the express route circuit being peered into the VNet. This is actually probably a better, I've recently added some additional slides. This might be the one I actually go towards. I like the idea of this being peered. That would represent the peering model into the express route gateway in the Azure VNet. And then everything talks to one another by way of the express route global reach. So that's how you get the full comprehensive solution. So mental note to self, take out the older slide, put in the newer slide. The management components. So just like any other Azure resource, everything is sort of on the left as you start to drill into resources. And I'll showcase this in a demo, but these are the big pieces that you'll handle, right? So connectivity, identity, clusters, all of the add-ons. Then this is the simplified NSXT interface. So if you're not as familiar with NSX, good news, you don't have to be a whiz. You just need to know how to get into the Azure Resource Manager portal, and you can handle some of the pieces you would need to from a networking perspective. The identity is cool. So this highlights it here, and I'll show it in a live demo shortly. But you've got your web client URL. This is the account that would access your vCenter environment on that jump host. And you would just copy that password. So when AVS first came out, this go around, you'd have to supply your own password, and within 90 days it would expire. So you'd have to work with support to reset it. Well, Microsoft decided to take on that as an extra burden of responsibility, and that gets lifecycled behind the scenes. So all you're on the hook for is just being able to know how to get into the portal, click on this copy icon, and then you're able to take that into your environment. In terms of access, you could access it by any of the Cloud Shell. That's what this icon is. It's Cloud Shell. So it's the AZ CLI, PowerShell, or the jump host. So that's kind of the management side of it. And then it's vSphere using Cloud Admin. So instead of administrator at vSphere.local, it's Cloud Admin at vSphere.local. And it's a slightly different user account, or administrator account, I should say. It's not really a regular user account. You don't have root access to the ESXi hosts. And as we talked about in terms of the shared responsibility model, that should match up. Microsoft will handle that for you. If you ever need root access, you can always get a hold of Microsoft, and they can work with you to give you access in a shared screen kind of remote session. But just know that the Cloud Admin, it's like the administrator at vSphere.local, but you can't do certain things like identity management without a ticket into Microsoft, as well as you don't have root access to the ESXi host, which could be a blessing or a curse depending upon your environment, right? The HCX pieces will show up in the HCX portal. So site pairing, interconnect, network extension, migration, and disaster recovery. That's where you'll see the bulk of your administration tasks show up. And then I like talking about the integrations, and I often say it's like achievement unlocked. You know, you really beat a hard boss in one of your video games, so you get that nice, neat Xbox achievement unlocked. So bringing your VMware infrastructure into Azure gets you a lot of interesting integrations from an Azure perspective. So these are the popular Azure VMware Solution integrations right now. NetApp files for a file share, blob storage, leaning on Azure Traffic Manager and application gateways, dependent upon whatever web apps you're trying to display to the world at large. There's support for hub and spoke. So that topology, as we always talk about it, if you're moving everything into Azure, there's support for hub and spoke, leaning on the AVS solution. There's Azure Backup Server, Azure Monitor, and then Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel. So Azure Security Center is more like the baselining in your environment. And then Azure Sentinel is the SIEM and the SOAR solution. So it's security incident event management and security orchestration and SOAR, security orchestration and automation response. So that's what Sentinel does. I had to think about that. I was like, SOAR. Okay, got it. But yeah, so those work in conjunction. One won't ever replace the other because they have two different functions inside of Azure, but they're very much so. I joke they're kind of like fraternal twins. They're not identical, but they're very heavily related in terms of the way that they kind of operate inside of Azure. So this is like a quick high-level overview. So we can think about the SDDC sitting down here. You've got VMs that live there. You can think about Azure Defender. So that's something you would enable with Azure Security Center. And that gives you more feature-rich components of being able to visualize security baselines for the VMs. So the best way to think of this is these are kind of like VMs in your on-prem environment. That's the only thing that's a little bit of an awkward mental exercise. You have to still think of them as kind of like separate, right? Kind of like they're still your on-premises environment, but they're closer to the ARM APIs, so it's easier to make use of Azure things. So that's just the one thing, and you'd have to enable Azure Defender to get the right security baselines. Everything talks to a log analytics workspace. So that's that awesome data analytics engine. You can have your own dedicated cluster if you were huge. If you were smaller and you were building out this environment a little bit more, you could always start with the version that's sort of logically separate with different customers. Once you have the Log Analytics workspace, you can funnel in Azure Monitor events. So Azure Monitor is kind of the larger umbrella. Log Analytics sits underneath, and Log Analytics is the way to visualize your Azure Monitor data. That's both metrics and log data. These two over here, Azure Automation and Update Management. So you don't have to bring SCCM into Azure or create some sort of distribution point out there. You could lean on our PaaS solution that's called Azure Update Management that also leans on Azure Automation. So that's where you could schedule your updates. You don't have to stand up the additional infrastructure. And then Azure Security Center, same thing. It reports to a Log Analytics workspace. You can create alerts both within Azure Security Center or Azure Sentinel. You have some ITSM integrations as well. So, I mean, this hopefully showcases, and it's a pretty generic architecture flow, but there's a lot of neat, nifty operational tooling that you gain access to by being closer to the ARM APIs. I like to talk a little bit about this just because we do tend to talk about this in our conversations with customers. So Microsoft Azure Backup Server is sort of like System Center DPM. It's like DPM light. You can't use a tape library, right? But you could think about leaning on this if you didn't want to extend or bring your third-party solution into Azure. So it gives you an opportunity to back up your VMs inside of Azure VMware Solution to an IaaS VM that lives inside of Azure and then offloads those snapshots on a regular basis to a recovery services vault. It tends to be one of those things where customers might deploy this in conjunction with a third-party solution, or this might be something that they lean on while they figure out what they want to do in terms of a backup solution. You might also just be able to live on it as well, right? If you're a heavy System Center shop, it should feel really familiar to you. You shouldn't have to, you know, the learning curve is minimal then in that regard. This is the quick architecture. So you've got your recovery services vault over here. That's a PaaS resource. You've got your ABS environment over here, server 1, server 2. That will go through the express route circuit of the ABS environment, and that will then back up to your MAB server. So the MAB server has local disk. It has to store a handful of days. It could just be one day, and then it offloads it to the recovery services vault. This is not equipped to take the snapshots without having it stored somewhere. So think of this as kind of your stopgap sort of solution in the event that something gets corrupt that day. You could probably restore from last night's backup off of the disks that are deployed on this server inside of Azure. But it's a fairly inexpensive solution if it's something that, you know, you're trying to figure out what you want to do with a backup solution in your environment. I just took a look at our backup vendors, and apologies, my allergies are acting up today. So got like an itchy nose. Somebody's thinking about me. That's what my mom used to always say.
You're
right?
fine. You're fine.
So anyway, so I read this today. We have a handful of new vendors. So it used to be Commvault, Veritas, and Veeam. Well, now we have Cohesity, Dell Technologies, and Rubrik. So I know more are in the process of being certified. So if there's a backup vendor that you're in love with, you love a lot, chances are it already is available, or it might be in the pipeline. So if you're interested in the solution, I'd reach out to your backup vendor and see what their timetable's like to integrate with Azure VMware Solution. Let's talk a little bit about support. We've touched on it a little bit here, but this sort of hits it home. It's validated, supported, and certified by VMware and Microsoft. It's a joint effort to support your environment, but Microsoft is your single point of support. So Microsoft will kind of take that first stab, so to speak. Microsoft will troubleshoot all of the Azure components, and then they will lean on VMware for any vSphere component, vCenter, any of the vSAN. If there's something with the vSAN, that's when Microsoft will get a hold of VMware for you. You don't have to open up 2 tickets. And Microsoft continues to be that central point towards resolution, which is awesome. So I get asked a lot, how can I learn more about Azure VMware Solution? It's a hard environment to demo. It's a hard environment to get access to. So VMware has hands-on labs, and this little short URL at the bottom, and I'll definitely pass a copy of this over to you, Chris. That way you could showcase it or distribute it. I'm not sure how you do this, but I think these links are really handy.
I'll put the link into the show notes.
Okay, perfect. So this is a click-through hands-on lab, just like everybody's used to in the VMware world, right? That's how you would get used to, unless you wanted to run your own home lab, which mine's over here. But I mean, there was a period of time where I couldn't afford a home lab. So these labs were invaluable to me. And in this scenario, same thing. So the 2 labs that are published right now deal with deployment and connectivity, as well as migration. More are in kind of the works, so to speak. So keep coming back or paying attention to the Azure VMware Solution service. More of these will show up over time. And we have a Learn module. Now we are also in the, honestly, I think I got wind that we might be able to publish the first 3 Learn modules in very short order here. So this is the deployment one. I wrote this one. I've got a colleague of mine writing the intro one, and I'm writing the migration module. And mine's almost done. And I can say that I hope somebody at Microsoft's not going to, whack my hand. I'm writing it. It's my own module, and I know it's very close to being published. And then our hope is we have a core foundational path for Azure VMware Solution. Unfortunately, we don't have capacity to build out the same click-through demos, at least at this point in the Microsoft Learn realm, but I suspect that will evolve and change, especially as more of these Azure dedicated solutions come to light, right? Customers need to know how to handle Nutanix in the cloud, Azure VMware Solution, NetApp, et cetera, and it's hard to have those environments just at your disposal at any time. So, but yeah, so the first 3 Learn modules will be the intro, the why, what is Azure VMware Solution and why should you choose it? This is the deployment module, right? So this is where you prepare to migrate your workloads and you deploy Azure VMware Solution. And then there's a migration module that will show up in very short order here. I also like these links just because sometimes folks don't realize we have a landing page for Azure VMware Solution. We do. And there's a lot of great tutorials. So as these integrations have grown, more and more documentation shows up here. So that very first link especially is really helpful if you do have an AVS environment and you're trying to figure out, how to integrate something like Azure Monitor or Azure Security Center. It's the AVS documentation. That's where it shows up. The AVS overview, that's sort of the marketing landing page. That might be something you'd pass a business decision maker who's trying to figure out, does this make sense? There's a lot of really great scenarios on there to showcase the value proposition. So then there's the Azure VMware Solution videos. They're a little older. Those videos follow around Cloud Simple. I should have put my video on there. I was featured on Azure Friday last week. So I did a demo of a very, kind of high-level overview of Azure VMware Solution. I'll go through that today as well. But if you're ever curious, we're starting to build out more content here. So I'll give a plug to Jeremiah. He's been really instrumental in getting us an environment and helping build that use case for these integrations. So you'll probably see more video tutorials from our team over the course of the next fiscal year at Microsoft, because if you follow Microsoft, we're getting towards the end of our fiscal year. So our brand new fiscal year starts July 1, and you should hope to see more interesting content coming from our team. The HCX documentation is a great spot to land too. A lot of our documentation kind of sends you there. And then I also talk, I always showcase the release notes just because of the fact that we do upgrades and we do pick different versions, and you may need to know version compatibility, right? And there's ways in which to apply a Band-Aid and make an older environment work with a newer version. But, it's a great link to have just so you know where you stand in terms of your on-prem environment. I also link to the Azure Migrate documentation as well, just because of the fact that I think a lot of folks don't really know. I mean, I take that back. A lot of folks do know it exists, but if you're newer to Azure, newer to the Azure service offerings, this is an awesome spot to go because you could think about a number of different scenarios within your environment. It's not just Azure VMware Solution. So you could start to realize the value of what that will cost. So it's kind of a cool bit of documentation. It shows you how to stand everything up, how to take a look at kind of building out additional hubs so you can think about your database migration, your web app, your database, your web app, your database, your VDI. I feel like I'm missing one. Maybe I'm not. And then AVS and then IaaS. So it's really helpful to start to pick apart what that might look like for you. And that rounds out everything I was prepared to show. So I think now comes the demo. So let's see. Oops, I had that demo live. Okay. So let me do this. That's on. Okay. So just like every Azure resource, you go search for it in the marketplace. This is the product you would want to deploy. But no, so long as you put VMware in here, you're going to get a lot of interesting. So this is where you get the Cloud Simple service. Don't deploy this. Like I said, you could if there were features you needed in Cloud Simple, but net new customers are, encouraged to embrace the version that's kind of where we are right now. So it's as simple as clicking on create, right? And the weird part about this is you can't deploy multiple instances. So I already have this deployed in the subscription that's linked here. But let's say you didn't. Let's say you had kind of jumped the gun. If you see this, it tells you Azure VMware Solution is available for all customers with an existing Microsoft Enterprise Agreement or those under a cloud solution provider Azure plan. So prior to creating and deploying your Azure VMware Solution private cloud, please review and follow the process for node allocation. So you're like, okay, cool. What do I do? You click there and boom, you're in our documentation. So it shows you how to open up a ticket. And then at the tail end of this, you'll go to the next step, which is registering the resource provider. So there's a resource provider for every single Azure resource. And most likely Azure VMware Solution isn't registered within your subscription. So you'd have to register that in order to be able to deploy it. But let's just say I didn't have an instance deployed in the subscription, right? And I was getting ready to deploy it. I'd have to tie it to a resource group. It's just a logical designation from sort of a metadata perspective. The location I have my nodes is North Central, but like as you saw, there's a number of different regions. These are the recommended regions. These are the regions where everything you want to consider deploying. Give it a name. Just call it that because I'm not going to deploy it. Also know the deployment's between 2.5 and 3.5 hours. And if you think about that, it's deploying the nodes, it's installing ESXi, it's building vCenter, it's building HCX, it's peering the express route circuit if you choose to peer it when you go through this. Or, there's a couple ways to peer your express route circuit, but there's a number of automation pieces that are happening behind the scenes, right? The vSAN provisioning, partitioning the vSAN, building out that, right? So a lot of automation that's happening behind the scenes. You would be able to pick a SKU, but remember it's already deployed. So what would show up here would be the AB36 node. If I was eligible to be able to go up to say 5 nodes, that's where I could indicate 5 nodes. I could leave it at 3. This is where you'd need to provide an address block. So let's just do 10.5.0.0/22. Remember, it needs a /22. You can make it be bigger if you wanted it to be bigger. But what happens is Microsoft will also carve up the subnets for you. So I'm not a networking nerd by trade. That's another one that I've had to embrace more of as everything's moved to a software-defined world in terms of cloud. So, Microsoft will handle that for you. And then you can tie it to a virtual network. So what you need here is you need a gateway subnet. And that's the only way you can deploy this. And what it does is, let's say you tied it to a virtual network. If you clicked review and create, or you went to add some tags, it will automatically provision a virtual network gateway for you. So a lot of brand new customers choose to do this because they don't have an express route circuit just yet. They haven't really thought through virtual networks, right? Or what that looks like. Customers who have environments inside of Azure, they might already have an existing express route circuit. So you could choose to leave this blank and then peer after the fact. So what I tend to say is if you're a brand new customer, tie this to a virtual network that has a gateway subnet. Microsoft will provision all the right infrastructure for you. If you've got an express route circuit and a VNet and you've got some, pieces of your environment inside of Azure, leave this blank and you can still hit review and create and then create. But I mean, how much more straightforward could it be? Like, I don't know if you were like me, but my vSphere upgrades and vSphere build outs and vCenter deployments would take months, swinging servers from different environments, doing upgrades. Within about 2.5 to 3.5 hours, you have a full-blown enterprise scale environment, which is just crazy. Let's go into the SDDC that I have. So you can see here,
Just to make do a quick time check, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I didn't want to.
No worries, no worries. And that's going to probably round us all the way out.
Okay.
So, these were all carved up. These are management networks, right? And just like a lot of the other Azure resources, you've got activity log, IAM tags, diagnose and solve problems, and locks. That follows suit to most Azure resources, as does the monitoring section, the automation section, and then the troubleshooting and support section. So as I had shown you in the slide, this is where we get into the actual components you can manage inside of Azure. So I have Azure Mask on. Let me turn it off temporarily. There's your vMotion network. I didn't do anything but give it a /22 CIDR block. It carved this up for me. My private cloud management network, it carved that up for me. I could choose to internet enable this, and that's where you can start to think about extending what you're doing in terms of Azure Virtual WAN or any of the application gateways. You can start thinking about interesting ways of internet enabling this instance. You don't have to, right? It's really up to you. Turn Azure Mask back on. This is the express route ID, the private peering ID. You could request an authorization key, and that's just the way to redeem that you want your express route to be able to work with this environment. So this was the key that Microsoft created for me when I tied my AVS environment to an existing VNet with a gateway subnet. And then I added virtual WAN into the environment. So I had to create a key, right? It's just as simple as giving it a name and it'll show up here. And this key is sensitive. That's why it's kind of grayed out. This is your HCX environment. I'll take this off for a second. It gives you an IP address, right? An activation key. This is if you've got your public IP. So if you had internet enabled and you wanted to configure your public IP, you could configure it here. Nice. And this is where you could tie your on-prem express route circuit into AVS. You would need to enable global reach. So you would tie it to an existing express route circuit. And then that starts to start advertising routes between your on-prem environment and AVS. Identity is what I showed earlier, right? So this is where everything shows up in terms of the IP address, the user account, you're copying the password in. It's kind of cool. The clusters, you could edit the cluster count. You could go up to, like, I can go up to 4. If I need more than 4, I'd have to open up a quota request. These are your segments, right? So this is what gets kind of created by default, but you could add additional segments if you weren't super savvy with NSX. You could add it here. We've exposed this. That's kind of our, I joke, it's kind of like our secret sauce, right? Like we've been able to do this for customers that didn't embrace NSX really on the on-prem realm. If you had a DHCP server that you might need, you could add that in here. Of course, it needs to be in the AVS environment, but you could handle all the NSX components here. You could think about port mirroring to troubleshoot network connectivity. And then this would be where you think about maybe building out some DNS zones. It's not Azure DNS, it's DNS that's tied to AVS, and then DNS service, right? So those are the pieces you're able to control in the portal, which is pretty interesting just because of the fact that I think people forget that it's just straight VMware. So let me get into the environment real quick here. And I think that'll round out the demo. So
as you're doing that, can you leverage Azure DNS within there? You
can. It would just be a different resource that you would provision. So you would go up here and you would search for Azure DNS, and then you would tie it. Yeah, there's a way you can link it to a virtual network. You would link it to the virtual network that you created, that you peered your express route into, and then it could make use of it. So, but anything that's tied to AVS specific, like I think of it's more of the legacy based DNS. That's where you would kind of tie it, and that would have to kind of live in the AVS instance.
Okay, thank you.
Never remember my password, which is probably a good thing. And then we'll connect in. So this is actually kind of cool. So.
Or not.
Oh, you know what? I had the wrong username. Try it again.
There we go.
Let's try it again. User error.
All right.
It's late in the day. So the thing I want to bring about, like, so I'm on my actual machine here. But what's weird is I'm also in an HTML5 instance of the server. Now, if you go back to this jump host, let's go to the overview. There's no public IP, right? But I'm going through that Azure Bastion host. And that is the cool stuff, I think. I love Azure Bastion. So let's go into the ABS instance. Let's go back here and get what I'm looking for. Just copy this. Looks just like VMware, right? We're logging in like it's an older version. It's not 7, right? And remember, we're leaning on Cloud Admin. Okay, yeah, it'll save that for me. Let's go into the admin portal. And here we are. So I was in HCX. So let's go to the home, right? It looks just like it normally does. There's hosts and clusters. I don't have anything in here because we've been, like I said, we've been building out these learn modules. So I've been kind of tearing this down and spinning it back up. Right. You will still see things like this, right? Dell EMC. We could always change that in the future though, right? So when I talked about the hardware and the hardware and the software specifications, it'll still look like it normally does in terms of what you deploy on-prem, but this could easily change down the road to something that's not Dell EMC, right? You'll know it's inside of Azure though because of this. But if you had a system admin that had high anxiety thinking about cloud, I guarantee most of this would lessen the anxiety, right? And you could build out, VMs and templates. I don't have anything, like I said, I've been taking this environment up and down, but you could build out VMs and templates. Here's your vSAN data store, and then the networking that gets spun up. So and you don't have to think about doing too much extra that you normally would. And then you can get into HCX or vRealize. You can go into the update manager. There's all kinds of interesting stuff. I think the thing that changes ever so slightly is the administration, just because, like I said, the cloud admin role is like the administrator at vSphere.local, but you don't have root access because remember, Microsoft is on the hook for all of that. And so we programmatically handle that for you. And if you ever needed it, so for instance, if you needed to join this to your Active Directory domain, it would be ticket into support, and then you'd work with support in a remote screen share, and you would then join it to your domain. So yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell.
Nice.
So yeah, and I think that kind of rounds out what I was planning on showing. So I don't know if there's any questions. I don't know if.
Well, I have like knowledge questions that I want to learn more about it, just from the perspective of I've seen VMware for a very long time, obviously, and I've seen VMware on AWS, and now seeing it through the lens of Azure, I have like lots of not disparity questions, but questions about the differences and how you're parsing this and how you're parsing that. But that's like literally that could be like an entire rabbit hole on its own. And we are definitely out of time.
No worries. Well, if you have any other questions in the future, if anybody does that's paying attention, drop me a line, let me know, and maybe I could do an additional session maybe down the road a bit, because like I said, we're building out the integration story. We're building out more unique scenarios that we're hearing from the field, because customers always have unique ways that they've built out environments. So I don't know if you felt that way. I don't know. I can't remember. You've done consulting, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So there's always an interesting customer somewhere. And so those customers we tend to hear from, and we wind up, building out integration stories that might make sense for some of these edge case scenarios as well. So it's not just the common use cases. We might even be focusing on some of the edge cases, just in the event of getting info out there and how to make better use of the tooling.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that a lot of my questions particularly will be answered by the plethora of links that you're going to be sending me for all of the resources that I'm going to put into the show notes.
Definitely.
So that'll be some good reading for me.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, it's kind of a hard one to demo, but those click through labs on VMware, as well as the learn path, because it will be a full-blown path in very short order. I think both of those will help in terms of kind of solidifying what you have to pay attention to in the event that you decided to deploy it in your own environment on behalf of a customer, et cetera.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Jeremiah said that you were 11 kinds of amazing, and he was not wrong. This was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much.
No problem. No problem. He's a great boss, and he's been a really good mentor too. So he's and I don't know, he's so even keeled. I don't know.
You don't have to butter him up.
Well, I don't know
not
if he
gonna
does
see this.
yoga or if he like what, but he's always just so like namaste. That's what I always think of. I think he's like, spent the morning, chanting or something. I don't know. I don't know. He's a unique dude. That's for sure.
We will have to make fun of him at our next
We will.
conference together. Cool. All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Have a wonderful evening. Check out the links in the show notes and follow up with Shannon on either Twitter or LinkedIn if you have any additional questions.
All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good night.